Clara Holcomb held her breath as she pushed aside the heavy, frost-covered rhododendron leaves, her fingers scraping against the frozen bark. Behind the tangled wall of green and white, half swallowed by 35 years of mountain growth, was a massive oak door set directly into the hillside. Iron hinges, orange with rust, clung to the stone frame like the knuckles of an old man refusing to let go. She had bought this property yesterday. $1 silver laid flat on the worn oak counter of the Kettle Hollow General Store, while every man in the room stared at her like she'd just volunteered to walk into a burning building. The county had been trying to auction off the Sloane property for 11 years. Nobody would touch it. 50 acres of steep Appalachian rock, a rotting one-room cabin with a caved-in porch, and the lingering reputation of Eliza Sloane, a woman who had vanished from these mountains in the winter of 1902 and had never been found. Not a bone, not a shoe, not a single strand of silver hair. Clara didn't believe in hauntings. She believed in a leaking roof, 2 hungry children, and the fact that winter was 3 weeks away. But standing here now, staring at the heavy timber door, she noticed something that made the skin on her arms prickle despite the thick wool of her rust-red shawl. The padlock, hand-forged iron, old enough to have been made on a blacksmith's anvil, wasn't locked. The hasp had been sheared clean through. The marks on the iron were bright, fresh silver against the rust. Someone had been here. Recently. She looked over her shoulder. The hollow was silent. No birds, no wind. Just the distant rush of Sawyer Creek somewhere far below, muffled by the snow that had begun falling an hour ago. Clara reached forward, gripped the freezing iron ring handle, braced her boots against the rock, and pulled. The door resisted for a heartbeat, then gave way with a groan that echoed up the hollow like a wounded animal. A rush of cold, perfectly still air hit Clara's face. It didn't smell like rot. It didn't smell like the damp, sour earth of an abandoned place. It smelled sharply of dried mint, cedar oil, and something underneath those metallic and faintly sweet like the inside of an old copper kettle. She fumbled a match from her apron pocket, struck it against the stone, and touched the flame to the wick of her kerosene lantern. Golden light flooded forward into the darkness. Clara's knees almost buckled. Floor to ceiling, across 3 walls of heavy oak shelving that had been mortared directly into the mountain rock, sat hundreds of glass mason jars. They caught the lantern light and threw it back in fractured colors: amber, deep green, pale gold, cloudy white. The jars were packed tight, organized with obsessive precision. Dried roots like gnarled fingers, pressed leaves layered thin as paper, crushed bark in shades of cinnamon and charcoal, pale powders that could have been flour or could have been ground bone. Every single jar wore a small paper tag tied to its neck with hemp twine. Clara stepped inside. The temperature dropped so suddenly it felt like walking into cold water. She raised a lantern and tilted the nearest jar toward the light. Inside were twisted, dark brown roots. The tag, written in a spidery cursive so precise it looked engraved, read, "For the black lung cough, steep 1 pinch in boiled water with sourwood honey. Strain through clean muslin. Do not give to children or women carrying. Gathered October 1899. North ridge above Sawyer Creek, 3 days past the full moon." Clara read it twice. She set the jar down carefully and picked up another. This one held clusters of tiny dried purple flowers. "For the grief that won't leave, brew at dusk. Let the patient drink slowly while facing east. It will not cure them, but it will let them sleep without dreaming. Medicine for grief." Clara put the jar down. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. She had just bought the legendary apothecary of Eliza Sloane. In the center of the cellar, On a small but impossibly sturdy table made of hand-planed chestnut wood sat a leather-bound ledger. The leather was cracked and dark with age, the bindings stitched with what looked like sinew rather than thread. Clara set her lantern on the table, the golden light making the glass jars glow around her like a cathedral of amber and jade, and untied the stiff leather strap. The first page smelled of dried lavender pressed between the sheets. The handwriting was the same spidery cursive from the jar tags. The first entry was dated October 14, 1898. They are coming for the timber first. I can hear the Elkhorn Company men marking the old chestnuts with red paint from half a mile away. Next, they will come for the coal underneath. They will tear this mountain open like a dog tears a rabbit, and everything that grows in this soil, every root, every leaf, every living thing I have spent 40 years learning to speak to, will be poisoned or burned. I cannot stop them. But I can save the seeds. I can bury the medicine where their machines cannot reach. If the mountain must bleed, at least its heart will keep beating in the dark. Clara closed the ledger. She sat in the freezing silence of the root cellar, surrounded by hundreds of jars of forgotten medicine, and pressed her calloused palms against her eyes. She had come here looking for a place to store potatoes. She had found something else entirely. Over the next 3 weeks, Clara lived 2 lives. During the daylight hours, she patched the cabin roof with salvaged tin, stuffed rags into the gaps between the logs to keep the wind out, and fed her children, 6-year-old Samuel and 4-year-old Mary, on cornmeal mush and whatever squirrel meat she could trade for at the general store. At night, after the children were asleep under every quilt she owned, Clara went down into the cellar. She read the ledger the way a starving person eats, desperately, unable to stop. Eliza Sloane's entries were not the ramblings of a superstitious old woman. They were meticulous, scientific, precise. Every remedy listed the exact plant, the exact part to harvest, the exact season, the exact preparation method, and the exact dosage. Alongside the instructions were detailed charcoal sketches of each plant. The leaf shape, the root structure, the flower pattern, drawn with the skill of someone who had spent decades observing. But the ledger was also a diary, and the diary told a story that made Clara's blood run cold. An entry from March 1900 read, "Ezekiel Blackwood came to my door today. He wore a city coat and carried a leather satchel full of legal papers I cannot read. He says the Elkhorn Coal Company has purchased the mineral rights to the entire North Ridge, including the ground beneath my cellar. He offered me $30 to vacate. I told him the mountain was not his to sell. He laughed. He has a laugh like a shovel scraping against rock." June 1900, they dynamited the old chestnut grove above Paint Creek. I felt the blast in my teeth. 40 trees, some of them older than the Republic, reduced to splintered wood in 9 seconds. The timber crews hauled them away on mule carts. The men who did this do not understand what they have destroyed. The chestnut was the backbone of this mountain. It fed the bears, the deer, the turkeys, the people. Without it, the soil will wash away, the streams will fill with mud, the animals will leave, and the people will have nothing left but the company store and the coal dust in their lungs. August 1900. The company doctor arrived in town last month. He charges $2 to see a patient and sells patent medicines made of sugar water and grain alcohol for $3. He told old Margaret Hensley that her husband's cough was simply mountain air and sold her a bottle of Dr. Pinkham's tonic for 50 cents. Thomas Hensley has black lung. I know the sound of it. I brought Margaret a jar of my mullein and boneset tea. Thomas will live. The company doctor's patients will not all be so fortunate. Clara began experimenting. She didn't know these plants. She had grown up in a Pennsylvania mining town, not on an Appalachian ridge, so she started slowly. She opened jars and smelled the contents, comparing them to Eliza's sketches. She crushed small amounts between her fingers, learning to identify roots by texture. Bloodroot was smooth and bled a vivid orange-red sap when scratched. Golden seal was knotty and bitter, leaving a yellow stain on her skin that wouldn't wash off for days. Wild ginger smelled sharply of pepper and earth. She made mistakes. One evening, she brewed what she thought was wild parsnip tea and took a small sip. Within minutes, her tongue went numb and her vision blurred at the edges. She grabbed the ledger with shaking hands and found the sketch. She had confused wild parsnip with water hemlock, a plant that could kill a grown man in under an hour. The only thing that saved her was the tiny amount she'd tasted. She spent the next 4 hours sitting on the cellar floor, her back against the cold stone wall, waiting for the numbness to fade, the ledger open on her lap to the page where Eliza had written in underlined capitals, "Never harvest near standing water." The hemlock favors wet ground. The parsnip favors dry. If unsure, cut the stem. Hemlock bleeds clear, parsnip bleeds milky sap. There is no second chance with this mistake. After that night, Clara treated every jar like it contained a loaded gun. The real test came in the second week of December, and it didn't come from a stranger. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of Samuel coughing. Not the dry, scratchy cough of cold air, a deep, wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath his ribs. She pressed her hand to his forehead. His skin was burning. His lips were tinged blue-gray. His chest heaved with every breath, each inhale producing a sound like water being poured over gravel. Pneumonia. The white lung sickness. The disease that buried more mountain children than rockfall and snakebite combined. Clara pulled on her boots and ran through the snow to the cellar. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the lantern. She pulled the ledger open to the page she had bookmarked with a strip of cloth. Eliza's instructions for pneumonia were detailed and specific. Boneset root, 1 thumb-sized piece, dried. Mullein leaves, a small handful. Elderberry, crushed, 2 spoonfuls. Steep in boiling water for the time it takes to recite the Lord's Prayer twice. Strain through clean flour sack. Add dark molasses or sourwood honey to cut the bitterness. Feed to the patient in small sips, never gulps. Repeat every 4 hours until the fever breaks or the patient worsens. She measured the roots with trembling fingers. Back in the cabin, she set the cast-iron kettle over the hickory fire and boiled the water until it rolled hard. She steeped the mixture, strained it, stirred in a spoonful of dark molasses she'd been saving for Christmas baking. The liquid was the color of black coffee and smelled like a forest floor after rain. Samuel was too weak to drink. Clara soaked a clean rag in the warm tea and squeezed drops onto his tongue, drop by drop. She did this for 6 hours, seated on the edge of his bed, her back rigid, her eyes never leaving his face. For the first 4 hours, nothing changed. The rattling grew louder. Samuel's skin turned the color of candle wax. Mary sat in the corner, silent, her small face tight with a fear no 4-year-old should know. Clara opened the ledger again, checking the proportions for the 3rd time, the 4th time. Had she used too little boneset? Too much mullein? Were the roots still potent after 30 years sealed in glass? She began to prepare herself for the possibility that her son was going to die in this cabin, in this hollow, on this cursed mountain, and that it would be her fault for trusting the writings of a woman who had vanished without a trace. Then, just as the first pale light crept through the gaps in the cabin walls, Samuel's breathing changed, the terrible grinding rattle smoothed out, not completely but enough. The blue tinge left his lips. His skin, still warm, was no longer burning. He opened his eyes, looked directly at Clara, and said, "Mama, I'm thirsty." Clara didn't cry. She was too exhausted for that. She simply filled a tin cup with clean water from the bucket and held it to his lips. And when he drank, she felt something shift inside her chest, not a weight lifting, but a door opening. A door she hadn't known was there. Seen from a different character's perspective, Thomas Hensley. Old Thomas Hensley had been coughing for 9 years. He'd worked the Elkhorn Mine No. 4 from the time he was 14 until a roof collapse crushed 3 of his ribs and ended his mining days at 51. The company doctor had told him the cough was natural, mountain air, dust, nothing serious. Thomas knew better. He'd watched 11 men from his crew die the same way. The cough that started dry turned wet, turned bloody, and ended in a pine box carried down the mountain on the shoulders of the men who would be next. When Thomas heard that the Holcomb widow had cured her own boy using something from the Sloane cellar, he didn't believe it. He'd lived in Kettle Hollow his entire life, and he remembered Eliza Sloane not as a legend, but as a real woman with dirt under her fingernails and a voice like someone slowly scraping a bow across a fiddle. He remembered the day she vanished. He remembered the coal company men who came through town the following week, asking no questions and answering none. But Thomas was dying. He could feel it in the way his lungs refused to fill all the way, as if someone had poured wet sand into the bottom third. So on a Tuesday morning in January, he put on his hat, picked up his carved hickory cane, and walked the 2 miles up the mountain to Clara's cabin. She answered the door looking like she hadn't slept in a week. Behind her, 2 small children sat at a table eating cornmeal mush. "I heard you got Eliza's medicine," Thomas said. "I have her cellar," Clara replied carefully. "I don't know if what's inside still works. It worked on your boy." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in. She brewed the boneset and mullein tea the same way she had for Samuel. Cast iron kettle, hickory fire, strained through a flour sack, sweetened with molasses. Thomas drank it. It tasted like boiled tree bark and dirt, and it was the best thing he'd ever put in his mouth. Within 3 days, the rattling in his chest diminished. Within a week, he could breathe deeply for the first time in 4 years. He walked back down the mountain without stopping to rest. When his wife Margaret asked him what had happened, Thomas sat down in his chair by the fire and said, "That woman up there is the real thing, same as Eliza was." Word moved through Kettle Hollow the way water moves through limestone, slowly, silently, and into every crack. Women began appearing at Clara's door. Sarah Jenkins brought her daughter, who had the whooping cough. Martha Cole brought her husband, a working miner whose hands had gone numb from lead exposure in the blasting caps. Old Agnes Prater, who lived alone at the top of Buckhorn Ridge, sent her grandson down with a note asking for something to help her sleep without nightmares. Clara treated them all. She charged nothing. She couldn't, morally, and she didn't have a medical license legally. The women paid her anyway in the only currencies the Hollow had: jars of blackberry preserves, sacks of dried corn, hand-knit wool socks, split firewood stacked by her cabin wall. By February, Clara had enough food stored to last until spring, and enough firewood to keep the cabin warm through the worst of it, but she also had a problem. The Elkhorn Coal Company's company store, the only store in the valley where miners could spend their company scrip, had noticed the drop in sales at their in-house clinic. The company doctor, a man named Dr. Harlan Webb, had seen his patient visits fall by half. Miners' wives were no longer buying his $3 bottles of sugar water. They were walking up the mountain instead. In March, A man Clara had never seen before appeared at the edge of her property line. He wore a dark gray wool overcoat that was far too clean for mountain mud, and polished leather shoes that sank into the thawing ground with every step. He carried a leather satchel. "Mrs. Holcomb," he called from the tree line, not crossing onto her land. "My name is James Vance. I'm a surveyor for the Elkhorn Coal Company. May I have a word?" Clara stood on her porch, Samuel and Mary behind her legs. "You can talk from where you are." Vance smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind worn by men who make their living taking things from people who can't afford lawyers. "The company has identified a significant coal seam directly beneath your property. We'll be filing for extraction rights. As a courtesy, I'm here to offer you fair compensation to relocate before the blasting begins." "How much?" $75. Clara looked at him. "And the cellar?" Vance's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "The cellar will need to be cleared and demolished for the shaft entrance. Standard procedure." "No." Vance tilted his head. "Mrs. Holcomb, this isn't a negotiation. The company owns the mineral rights. We're being generous by offering compensation at all. I'd encourage you to think carefully." "I have thought carefully, Mr. Vance. I thought about it the moment I laid my dollar on that counter. The answer is no. Now, get off my sightline before my hospitality runs out." Vance stood in the mud for a long moment, then turned and walked back down the path without another word. But as he disappeared into the tree line, Clara saw him stop and pull a small notebook from his satchel. He was writing something down. She couldn't see what, but she knew it wasn't a love letter. That night, at 2 a.m, Clara was jolted awake by the sound of heavy boots on her porch. Not one pair, 3. She grabbed the iron fire poker from beside the hearth and stood barefoot on the cold plank floor. Her heart slamming against her ribs, a voice came through the door. Not Vance, deeper, rougher, a voice used to giving orders underground. "Holcomb, you got until Sunday. After that, we're coming with sledgehammers and a court order. The cellar gets knocked down. The jars go in the creek. You can stay or go, makes no difference to us. But the cellar is done." 3 sets of boots walked off the porch and crunched away through the frozen mud. Clara stood in the dark, the fire poker in her hand, listening until the footsteps faded completely. Then she sat down on the floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and stayed there until morning. At dawn, Clara went to the cellar. She had been reading the ledger for 3 months now, and she had reached the final entries. The ones from November 1902, the ones written in handwriting that was less steady, the ink pressed harder into the page, as if Eliza had been writing with her whole arm rather than just her fingers. November 12, 1902, the last entry Eliza Sloane ever wrote. "Blackwood came today. He did not knock. He opened my door and stood in my home as if he owned it, which, I suppose, in the eyes of the law and the men who write the laws, he does. He did not offer money this time. He simply said, 'You have 3 days, old woman. I am not afraid of dying. I have lived long enough to see the chestnut trees fall. I have lived long enough to watch the company turn the creek water black. I am afraid of one thing only, that the seeds will be lost. Tonight I will hide the ark. I will seal it in the wall where their machines cannot find it. If I do not come back to this cellar, then whoever reads this, you are reading it for a reason. The mountain chose you. Find the false wall. Protect what is inside. Do not let them take the last of what this mountain was." Clara read it 3 times. Then she picked up her lantern and walked to the back wall of the cellar, the wall furthest from the door, where the shadows were deepest and the stone was covered in pale green lichen. She ran her hands over the rough surface, pressing her fingers into the mortar lines, Most of the joints were solid, hard as the rock itself. But near the bottom, just above the packed earth floor, she found a section where the mortar crumbled at her touch like dry sand. She pulled the first stone free. It was heavier than she expected, and it came out with a grating sound that made her teeth ache. Behind it was another stone. She pulled that one out too. And the next, and the next. Behind the wall was a cavity the size of a bread box, lined with thin cedar planks to keep out moisture. Inside sat a bundle wrapped in heavy waxed oilcloth and tied with leather cord. Clara lifted it out and carried it to the table. Her hands were coated in stone dust, and her fingernails were torn. But she barely noticed. She cut the leather cord with her pocket knife and unrolled the oilcloth. Inside were 24 small canvas pouches, each one stitched shut with tight, even stitches and labeled in Eliza's handwriting: American chestnut, golden seal, bloodroot, black cohosh, wild ginseng, ramps, Solomon's seal, wild yam, trillium spicebush. Clara picked up the pouch labeled American chestnut. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of the seeds inside. Small, hard, alive, even after 30 years sealed in darkness. The American chestnut had been the king of the Appalachian forest. A single tree could feed a family for an entire winter. The coal companies had clear-cut them for railroad ties. The blight had taken the rest. By the time Clara was born, there wasn't a living chestnut tree left in 3 counties. Eliza hadn't just been saving medicine. She had been saving the mountain itself. Every seed in these pouches was a species that the coal companies had driven to extinction in this hollow. This wasn't an apothecary. It was an ark. Clara didn't sleep the night before Sunday. She packed a bag for the children. She wrapped the seed pouches in cloth and hid them inside her mattress. She placed Eliza's ledger in the canvas satchel she wore across her chest, close to her body. If they were going to destroy the cellar, they would not get the 2 things that mattered most. At dawn, she walked down to the general store. Elias, the storekeeper, was sweeping the porch. "They're coming today," Clara said quietly. Elias stopped sweeping. He looked at her. Really looked at her. And then he set the broom against the wall, walked inside, and locked the front door. He flipped the sign to closed. "Go on back up," he said. "I'll be along." Clara didn't understand what he meant until she reached her property at 11:30 and found she wasn't alone. Standing in front of the cellar door were 73 people. She knew because she counted them, twice, unable to believe what she was seeing. They had come up the mountain path in 1s and 2s, silently, carrying nothing but themselves and whatever tool was closest to their front door. When they heard the news, Thomas Hensley stood at the front, his hickory cane planted in the mud, his breathing deep and clear. Sarah Jenkins stood behind him, her healthy daughter on her hip. Martha Cole was there, and Agnes Prater's grandson, and Elias, who must have run the long way around through the creek bed to arrive before her. Coal miners in their work clothes, soot still in the creases of their faces, stood with their arms crossed and their jaws set. Women in heavy wool coats held their children's hands. A 14-year-old boy Clara didn't recognize held a splitting maul across his shoulders like a yoke. Nobody spoke. They stood in the thin morning light, shoulder to shoulder, and waited. At noon, Vance came up the path. He had 2 men with him, both carrying sledgehammers. They walked with the confidence of men who had done this before, evicted families, demolished cabins, cleared land for the company. They expected a frightened widow and 2 small children. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Vance looked at the 73 faces looking back at him. He looked at the miners. His miners, the men who worked 12-hour shifts in his company's tunnels and bought their food from his company's store and lived in his company's houses. The men who had never, in living memory, refused a company order, today their eyes were hard as anthracite, and they were not moving. Clara stepped out from the crowd. She stood in her rust-red shawl, the canvas satchel with Eliza's ledger pressed against her ribs, and she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Thomas Hensley spoke. His voice carried across the clearing like a church bell. "Son, I've worked for your company since I was 14 years old. I gave them my back, my lungs, and 3 of my ribs. But I will not give them this cellar. You can tell Mr. Blackwood, or his son, or whoever sits behind that desk now, that if they want what's inside this mountain, they'll have to go through every soul standing here. And we ain't going nowhere." Vance stood in the mud, his polished shoes sinking slowly. He looked at the sledgehammers his men were holding. He looked at the splitting maul on the boy's shoulders. He looked at Clara, then he folded the court order in half, put it in his pocket, and walked away. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. They simply stood in the pale winter light, breathing together, until the last sound of Vance's footsteps faded down the mountain path. Then, one by one, they nodded to Clara and began walking home. Thomas Hensley was the last to leave. He tipped his hat to her and said, "Eliza would have liked you." By summer the snow was a memory, and Sawyer Creek ran clear and cold over smooth river stones. Clara knelt in the garden behind her cabin, a garden that hadn't existed 6 months ago. The dark Appalachian soil was warm under her knees. Around her, in neat rows marked with small wooden stakes, green shoots pushed up toward the June sun, American chestnut saplings, 3 inches tall, their first leaves unfurling like small green hands, reaching for something they'd been waiting 30 years to touch. Golden seal spreading low and broad in the shade of the oak tree. Bloodroot sending up its single white flower, delicate as paper. Samuel and Mary were chasing each other between the rows, laughing at nothing, the way children do when they feel safe. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, went inside the cabin, and came back with the leather ledger. She sat on the porch step, opened it to the last blank page, and dipped her pen in the small bottle of ink she kept on the windowsill. She paused. A whippoorwill was calling from the hemlock grove. Below her, through the trees, she could see the cellar door standing open, the afternoon light falling across the glass jars inside. The jars had been there for 30 years, waiting in the dark. They weren't waiting anymore. Clara pressed the pen to the page and wrote, "The mountain remembers what it was given, and it remembers what was taken. Today, the first golden seal bloomed under the hemlock tree. Samuel helped me water the chestnut saplings this morning. He is careful with them. He understands, I think, even at sickics, that some things are worth protecting. We are still here. We will always be here." She closed the ledger. The leather covers met with a soft, familiar sound. The whippoorwill kept singing. For the first time since James Holcomb's funeral, for the first time since she had stepped off the train in this strange, steep, beautiful country with nothing but a suitcase and 2 small hands holding hers, Clara felt something she had stopped believing she would ever feel again. Peace, not the absence of trouble, not the silence after a storm, but something deeper and quieter, the kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly where you belong, and knowing that the ground beneath your feet will hold.